I've been asking these newcomers here to raise what they see as the most problematic issues with the current trends. I'm also going to be asking all of you is, have we really given the audience an overview of what are the most pressing issues? Do we know the trends? Have we talked about the challenges? Have we talked about the right issues? But that's something I'll ask the panel to get back to. So closest to me, we have Sten Nilsson, expert on global forest sector analysis. He's been a professor in economic planning at the School of Agricultural Sciences and acting director for the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis and more. And now you're working as advisor in many capacity on forest issues. And sitting next to, do you want to add? Do you have a longer CV?
I'm not expert on anything any longer.
Okay, you used to be. You're a post-expert. Fair enough. Susanne, she's at least, maybe not an expert, but she's a senior advisor at the Swedish School of Agricultural Sciences. And she also is a part of the Swedish delegation at the Climate Convention with particular interest in forestry, RED and indigenous groups and these issues. And she's also part of her time is a colleague of mine. Which leads us to Gunnar from the Department of Economics here in Gothenburg, associate professor and director for the Environment for Development Initiative, who's been struggling with forestry and community rights ever since his thesis work, and followed it ever since. And he's also someone I see every now and then. So welcome all of you, the new panelists. And maybe if I could ask Sten to kick us off with the question you had prepared beforehand.
Yeah, I'm coming from the point of view of sustainable forest, not that much of sustainable society to start with. We have tried many approaches. We have tried with protected areas, payments for environmental services, certification, FLECT, UNFF, and most recently, rich people far away paying a lot of money. And none of it has really worked out. So the question is, will the community forestry or the improvement of the legal rights be the solution? I think Jenny pointed out an important observation that the legal actions have slowed down since 2008. I'm not really surprised. Number one is that we have had an economic crisis, recession, which means that the governments have had other problems. But I also think there is another fundamental issue. It's great with the legal rights, but it's not enough. We have to put it into a societal concept that we are trying to lift the society for well-being on all aspects, and the legal rights is an important component of it. So we need a bigger view on how to increase the well-being in the society.
So what is the most pressing issue that you would say? I mean, increasing the well-being of all people is obviously quite a challenge. But if you narrow it down somehow, what would that be?
It is to start with the development issue, a broader development issue, and build in
such as
legal acts in that part. I also think that David has a very good point. I don't, with an example from Mexico, I don't believe in incremental changes. I think you need dramatical changes in order to get this going and being sustainable, which we have sort of in Mexico. So,
okay, hard dramatic change. and not just tenure, but
No.
broader scale. Thank you, Sten, and we'll get back to you. And by the way, for your information, I'll be first having them some questions, and then you'll be talking among yourself in a while and see which is a question that these people are not discussing, that you want answered. But that your time will come. It will be a little while more when we go through these aspects. So perhaps, Gunnar, what did you think of as the most pressing, the problematic issues with the current trends that you see?
Thank you. I think we got a very good picture, but I would like to deepen the picture given particularly by Jenny and David a little bit. So there are the great expectations that Marie voiced in the morning, that these kinds of reforms that we've seen, although slowing down, would lead to better forests, more ecosystem services, but also reduced poverty, and particularly for the poor women. So always when you have these kinds of great expectations, we have to be a little bit careful and look at the empirical data, what is actually happening. And what Jenny showed, that there's much carbon actually sequestered in the forest. So the forests are actually becoming better, more dense, but at what cost? So when we look at the empirical literature of this kind of devolution of forest management to communities, what we typically see is that poor people, unfortunately, lose out. So the design of these local institutions is extraordinarily important. And it's not only about giving them the full rights, as you indicated. We did a very interesting study on the Van Panchayats in northern India, where they actually had full legal rights since the 1930s. Still now, after so many years, you still see the poor lose out. So which comes to your kind of final point there, David, that what we see in Mexico is kind of an outlier, because another problem with this focus on the conservation part is that these communities typically have a suboptimal silvicultural management, if you like. So we don't make the most use of these forests for actually economic development. So there are great opportunities with these kinds of reforms, but there are also great challenges. And in particular, you kind of whipped through that in 5 seconds at the end there. Eleanor Ostrom, of course, she looked at the design principles of maintaining these kinds of institutions. But what she came back to at the end of her career was to try to tease out what are the factors that actually create that kind of cooperation.
Can you say those 7 or? How many they are?
No, I don't think, yeah. We shouldn't go into that, because the point is that we know quite a lot of what can maintain it. But for these kinds of reforms, what is very, very challenging is to actually kick off the cooperation that leads to good management of the forest and equitable distribution of the returns.
Okay.
So that, I think, is a great challenge for the facility.
And the last point?
And I think I would like you to involve local researchers in following the management, to feed in knowledge all the time, to actually get it right.
Maybe Gunnar has some researchers in mind. We'll see. Thank you, Gunnar. And Susanne, from your point of view, what would you say is the most problematic issue with the current trend?
Well, I looked at the question more from my specific viewpoint. I work a lot with RED. And RED is very, very big in very many developing countries. And hopefully in a few years we will actually have a clear RED mechanism. And from that point of view, in this seminar here, I think that the issue of the slowed down decentralization and even maybe a re-centralization of tenure rights might come about, because who will benefit from the RED mechanism? I think there are places in the world, and maybe also countries, that are considering keeping the tenure to the forest tighter to themselves because of RED. And in connection with that question is the tenure of carbon, which is a totally new concept the latest 10 years. Who owns the carbon? And as I understand it, there are actually places in the world where people may own the forest, but the carbon is owned by the state. And if this big mechanism comes about, I think these two issues are something that we would have to look very thoroughly into. So my thoughts around this question has been specifically around RED. Yeah.
Okay. So Jenny, we hear a lot about carbon. I think Samuel mentioned it, you mentioned it now, Susanne heavily, and more or less everybody touched upon it. Is that the real issue for these forests? Is carbon and negotiations and maybe funding, is that the issue to discuss, or are there other drivers that are more important that are happening before we have a RED scheme set up, or are we discussing the right things?
Well, I think it depends on the perspective. I mean, I think from the perspective of people living in the forest, it's not, carbon isn't the important thing. It's the forest is the basis of their livelihoods and cultures and way of life. I think the reason that carbon has become an issue and a topic of discussion relates to the whole kind of international process of setting up mechanisms for potentially for carbon
keeping
markets.
Researchers busy and others.
Yes, exactly. And there, I wanted to pick up on what Susan said. There is a concern as part of that process, and I know this is something that Samuel has done work on as well, and many of our other coalition partners here, is that it starts to create carbon becomes a commodity in that kind of a framework, and so there's a risk then that it gets separated out from other forest values in ways that can actually impinge upon the rights and the livelihoods of communities in those forests. And that's something that we have started to look into as a coalition, as kind of what are starting to be some of the legal frameworks around carbon rights and how they relate to other community rights to forests.
But if we go down to some of the villagers you pointed out, Samuel, what are really the issues that they are? What would they say to our discussion? Are we talking about?
I think it's
are we
really
on track? Is
complex, because what they would say is not something that they could easily get, especially in the governance context we have. And carbon will not be an issue for them. Okay, they hear about it and they think those white people became even more crazy than before. So
picking up on that,
I think when we look at the carbon, it's the best way to bring international attention to how the forest is being managed. It's the best way to call more attention on a governance issue. It's a way to tell the decision makers in the countries with forest the wrong decisions that you are making have an influence beyond the boundaries of your country and beyond the generations. So it's a way to bring on board many more people who also have vested interest.
Yeah, what happens
So
what if you pick up on Susan's point, saying that maybe now if carbon in some future is really becoming a commodity, and who will benefit from that transition? Will that be these communities currently having customary rights, or someone else?
Also, here I have two quick things to say about it. The first thing is to use the carbon, and I don't think we have done this enough, and researchers have not been very busy on that. I think we should use the carbon value, the carbon economy to say, to challenge the decisions that are currently being made by the decision makers. Because their excuse is to say, we want money, this is why we destroy the forest. If you are able to say, by keeping the forest, you can get even more, I'm not sure this is the truth, but I think we need to have more research to be able to suggest more alternative to those people. And the second point is that, of course, having access to the revenue of the carbon will still be the same challenge for the communities. The only difference here, and it's a major difference, is that when you destroy the forest to generate revenue that are not going back to the communities, the forest is lost. When you keep the forest and you get revenue from the carbon, and the revenue do not go to the community, at least they can still use the forest. And if a change happens, they will be able to also have access to the revenue. So these are my 2 points.
David, I mean, what's coming out of your mouth is on a number of places is linking this aspect of governance, the central role of governance for making these systems happening on the ground, maybe not just introducing them, but also making a difference on how, and you said that Mexico might be an outlier. What is it really that others can learn from that experience? If you take it to more the general setting in maybe sub-Saharan Africa or some other region, or David, would you say?
That's a big question, and I also want to refer here to Sten's comment about dramatic changes being needed. And yeah, one of the things that made Mexico work is a major agrarian revolution in the second decade of the 20th century. So the question is, well, is that what it takes to devolve rights to local communities? Well, number one, that's not very likely in any country in the world today. Number two, I think there are some examples that show that it doesn't take an agrarian revolution to make this happen, and I think the most interesting and promising case of that is one that Jenny mentioned, and that's in the Guatemalan Petén, where the Guatemalan government, I don't know exactly how this happened at the policy level, because the Guatemalan government is not known for its progressive policies, but they did in the 1990s institute a policy of community concessions. So they're modeled upon industrial concessions, but so communities in the Petén have the concession to all forest products for 25 years with certain requirements. They have to get FSC certification and some others, but assuming they manage the forest well for 25 years, they are then renewable. Complicated setting, different from Mexico. They're colonization communities. Things aren't perfect, but it does seem to be showing that something short of full devolution of property rights can work, and something so that something short of full ownership can work. And I will leave it at that. Okay. Comment.
So who feels that we've picked up the challenge from Arne in this? That we really look at how we need a transformation of the economies in many parts of the world, not least in Africa. Who wants to pick up on that? Susanne?
I think this is, of course, very, very true. But what I think about when we say this, that you were speaking about timber, for example, that's what gives money from the forest. I've been working a lot with non-timber forest products, and they are called a safety net. It is very important for very many people. And I always think when people speak about economic development that, of course, we need that. We need to drag people out of poverty. But when we don't have that option, when there are no investments, or investments that are good for the rural poor, then what do? We cannot take away the safety net before giving people something else to live from. And I think that was also part of James speaking about. That's the big problem, of course.
Okay, now to get more energy here in the room, these people will listen carefully and they will discuss among themselves while you are discussing among yourself. I suggest you speak to your next door neighbor and the one sitting next to you. And for 5 minutes, you bounce your ideas. What is it that this panel is not talking about that you expected answers on and that you want to pose to the panel? What are the key issues that we need to address in this morning session before getting into the really looking ahead? What are the burning questions that have not been addressed or that you want deeper understanding of? So in groups 2 by 2, if you have to move, move. If you want to stay by the window, stay by the window. So get going, discuss for 5 minutes now questions that you would like to ask to the panel. Okay. I'm happy to hear so much noise. They really have to adjust the microphone almost to explode to stop you from stating your points. For some reason, I felt there was more energy all of a sudden in the room. Anyway, we're going to pick up on some of that energy, and we want to invite you to put some questions on the table, or I'll try to capture something on this one, and the audience, or sorry, the panel will listen, and sometimes you say, maybe you might be saying Sten, or something, maybe you said David or Gunnar or whatever, when you pose your questions. You may do so if you wish, and we'll try to accommodate that with the help from my panel. And I'll just start with, and try to be succinct in stating your questions. So there is one hand waving. I'll try to put something in writing first. Go ahead. No, speak up loud and we'll hear you.
Strengthen them in the negotiations with the big companies.
Okay. Yeah. How to lift expectations from the local people and lift it to the policy level and empower them to in negotiations, etc. We'll keep that one in mind and take another one, maybe somewhere in this corner. Yes. There are some microphones. I think there's. This might be working.
I have a question about, I think it was from Jenny's presentation on deforestation. And there were less deforestation in where communities had local rights. We saw the map and there were more, presumably much more deforestation outside these areas. And this suggests a trend, but again, I'm wondering if there hadn't been these local land rights allocated to these communities, can we safely assume that deforestation on the total would have been bigger, or had it just been spread differently?
Okay.
And I feel that perhaps we should also discuss what happens around these areas where ownership is allocated.
Okay, yes. So deforestation with or without rights, and do we know that the right made the difference, or are there other factors around, and what happens in protected areas? And Gunnar could speak for an hour, I know, and maybe more of you here, but we'll pick up on that in one way or another. Yes.
Okay. My name is Kirsten. I work in Myanmar on customary communal tenure, and I have a comment to you. I don't think the collective action is an evolutionary process. It's the original process. If you look at the Henry Main's report from India from the end of 19th century, it says common property is the natural state of affairs. Privatization only comes later. Anyway, we have a
That was a comment and now a question, right? Yeah.
The comment is that we think that we should learn more about the legal incorporation of communities in terms of being able to negotiate with the state. We want to maybe learn more about land issues, not only forest. And then my friend here has another comment on the
just want to I think we should not be very excited about the some of our success story or the trend. Looking at the figure seems to be quite successful. The challenge is we should not focus too much on the quantity. We should look at on the quality of the land as well.
Yeah.
Most of the time, the land given to the communities are very degraded land. It's not very useful for them, even for the subsistence level. Forget about the commercial scale. So that quantity is a bit of a challenge, you know,
to highlight more what happened on the quality of the land, not just the number of hectares being
Yes.
under certain rules.
Yes, that's
Okay.
important.
That's yes.
Yeah, another thing is, of course, the scale. Looking at the issues we are facing, deforestation rate is still very high. You know, about 30 million hectares a year. Yes. So, but at the same time, improvement. You know, the recognition of the land to the community, just 2 million a year. So the scale is still very. Even we try very hard. I want to say this.
So what is the question to the group?
We need to collectively, of course, work a bit more hard to make sure there's a serious investment from the international donors, as well as serious investment from the government and also the private sector to make this cost.
Okay, thank you. That was more of a comment than a right question, right? Yeah, thank you. Maybe one more before we let them. And I turn to you first, and Kenneth, you'll be somewhere later down the line. Yeah.
I'm Raymond de Chavez from Temteba. I have two questions. The questions for David and for Jenny. For David, about the ejido system in Oaxaca, in Mexico. We have a partner there, Servicios El Pueblo Mije. And recently, one of the worries or the concerns that they are raising is that the government is now trying to repeal or to roll back that ejido system. Right, so my question to you is, how do you view this, and then the implications of this, and also and related to what Jenny presented, when you saw the study in terms of the slowdown in recognition of tenure rights, are there also an increase in terms of governments rolling back those that they have recognized?
Thank you. Good. Okay, let's see who wants to pick up. We can maybe start with this one that David got right in his knee.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's easy for me to remember then. Yes, the Mexican government is. I do not know the details of the legislation that they are currently proposing, but what I can say is that the 1992 constitutional reform that I referred to, which devolved greater property rights to these two different agrarian forms, ejidos and comunidades, was intention. That was a neoliberal reform that it was hoped would create a private land market in Mexico. Yeah, elements of the Mexican government see the common property system in rural Mexico as a barrier to economic development. They would like to create a private land market, and that 92 reform was actually hoped it would do, because it did allow ejidos, but not comunidades, which are indigenous communities, but it allowed ejidos to privatize their lands, get private titles to them, and sell them off. But two observations about that. Number one, with respect to forest, if the ejido had forest on their property, there was an environmental protection in there that if they decided to divide up the agricultural land, privatize it, and be able to sell it, and dissolve the ejido, forest had to return to the state. So if you had any kind of forest on your land, that's a very powerful incentive to not dissolve your land. Why would you do that? Number one. Number two, that effort to privatize ejido lands in Mexico was very unsuccessful. Less than 6% of 31,000 ejidos elected to go that route, and I would argue because now a culture of common property management, which has been in existence in Mexico for, depending on the area, 40, 50 years, had now become part of the rural culture. So they don't want to dissolve.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Gunnar, sorry, Sten, you had a quick one.
Yeah, not respond to that, but general taking here. I think it's important that we are lifting ourselves outside the forest box, because the driving forces for many of these developments are not caused by forestry. It's caused by agriculture, mining, infrastructure. And that's going back to what I said earlier. We need to come with that view with respect to the legal actions. The deforestation today is driven by 75 to 80% by expanding agriculture. So we have to deal with the agriculture side. And that is leading us to the next step. But the key issue here is boiling down to governance.
And what do you see? What do you see in terms of governance that makes you happy? That was a tricky one.
You're asking that we have election time here, and I'm asking that question every time I hear the politicians. So,
but it
is that you're having a more integrated view. Number one is that you have a governance.
Yeah, not any governance, not just forest governance.
Not just let it go by itself. But that you have an integrated governance, that you are looking at land as a resource and not just forestry, but what landscape. And you're mentioning it, the landscape concept is very important. Also when you are having the legal acts, because the focus has moved away from flow of wood and cash to the state, the stocks, and the quality of the forest resources in order to deal with the environmental issues. And to deal with those, you have to deal with large-scale landscapes. And
Yeah, okay.
we don't really know how to do that.
Gunnar, would you be in a position to say anything about Jenny exposed her trends of how much is now under a certain regime, but as Ten said, what do we know about the quality, what's happening actually on the ground under different schemes? Could you, I know you could speak for hours, but a quick, your own view in very short time.
You know, I definitely think that this is the case, and I saw it on the field, CEDA project in India, that it is when the land is really degraded and there isn't much value directly to the forest department that it actually devolved to the people, and then it picks up again. So I think it is a fact that there's a lot of marginal lands that are devolved. But this is actually a trend. I mean, it's a big trend in China, it's a big trend in India, it's a big trend now in East Africa to have some kind of deal between the government. So it goes a little bit beyond these statistics that you show, these forest sector reforms that are happening, and to one way or another bring in the people. And I would like to link that over to Torsten's questions about what happens to the forest and to the forest next to the forest that is managed. Because when forest management in this case really means exclusion in a way. You keep people out of the forest and you're restricting the collection from the forest. And a lot of things happen then. Some people start to plant their own trees and collect from that, or they have improved stoves. Or as Torsten
and what happens
indicates,
outside?
They go outside and collect. But it's not a one-to-one kind of effect, because that's more expensive. They have to go further, so they reduce that kind of pressure. But this is one of the major challenges when it comes to MRV in the red, because there you want to have a cap of the whole country and see what is the net reduction in emission. So
sorry.
it is complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Important.
And it's complicated to answer the question, because that's why now nobody picked up on it. How to lift, how to empower, how can local people negotiate with the state or with the investors? Who wants to pick up on that aspect? Yes.
Yes, and again, I have to do it from the point of view of UNFCCC and RED, which is, so to say, my box here. And in the wordings today around RED, there are wordings about benefit sharing with local people and with stakeholder consultations. And actually those things have been pushed in by NGOs and by the whole circus around UNFCCC negotiations, because from the beginning there was nothing about involving local people in the wording. But I still think that it's very weak, and somebody, for example, from Colombia told me that if we're going to do true stakeholder participation and part of the decisions, it's going to cost us. There's so big transaction costs in doing it. So it's very weak, but it's there. And then also I want to refer to Torsten's question, because I think it's very pertinent, and especially from the point of view of the UNFCCC, that whatever we do on the ground, if we will see leakages to other areas. If you can't use this area, then you'll use another one. But I think for the seminar here, still, maybe we should stick to looking at what happens when communities get property rights over their land. And then, of course, it's a big issue with the leakage as well, but maybe we do that in a separate seminar.
Yeah. Okay, Samuel?
Yes, two quick comments on that. Two different possibilities, two situations. One is about policy issues, like in the red. We know very clearly that the government has to perform, including in terms of participation. So we go to the communities and we tell them about the obligation that the government has. And we tell the government about the obligation that they have. And we say, we understand it's not easy to do it, but you have to go through it. In the case of Cameroon, we were able to work together with other NGOs and the government and some communities to prepare a guide that the government will be using for searching the free prior informed consent of the communities. The interest is that we spent 6 months working on that, and the government approved this document as being his guide. And now for us, our understanding is that no single RED project will happen if this guide was not used to seek the consent of the communities. We want to use that beyond the RED projects. We want to use it because we say it's a government document now.
And is it a true ownership of the government? Is the government keen to have it used? I mean, I understand you are, but...
They approve it.
Yeah, that's one thing.
They sell it to all their donors, so it will be very difficult for them now to say they don't want to use it. It's like putting a foot in the door. Because now if they say they don't use it, we'll say, come on, you did it.
Okay.
So, okay. Yeah. This is the first set of things. And now with the companies coming in, if the company has a contract with the government and they go somewhere, like the case of the American company I told you about, we will go in the area and try to know what people think about the project. What type of impact are there? And then we will go to the company and tell them you have to talk to the people.
This sounds like the afternoon session when we're really going to talk about what are the strategic priorities and concrete actions to make change. Are there anything more for the understanding of the issue? Kenneth, I promised you one question, and then Jenny asked the word.
Okay, this goes back, I think this is a question for you, Samuel. My name is Kenneth Hermel. I'm from the School of Global Studies here in Gothenburg. In the introductory remark, we heard Arne Bixten talk about the trade-off. On the one hand, you had control and access to resources and to traditional livelihoods. On the other hand, you have poverty reduction, I think you said, Arne, or development, and Africa needs more investments. That was the conclusion of the introduction. I understood your remarks, Samuel, as a comment to that. When you said that there was no benefits to the local population, they were only stuck with, they were losing their livelihoods, they were evicted from their lands, and they were stuck with the debt. Did I understand you correctly?
Yes.
But he also said that investment is not the problem per se. With the current governance system, it's the problem, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But that was just a question for clarification. All right. Okay, a final question here. And please, for those of you who have not yet gotten a chance to ask your question to the panel, there will be post-it notes. Write your question down, put it on the wall there, and then we'll group them and feedback that to this group. So your questions will not remain hanging altogether. So please.
I mean, there's been a bit of discussion on what really is the problem. But in order to go to the second part of our discussion in the afternoon about actions, I think the missing link for me is really to understand why we have these trends. Why are these things happening? The drivers really for some of these things, and that can inform the sort of actions that we want to bring out in the second part of the discussion. So really, in explicit terms, what really are the problems, the drivers of these challenges that we see, of these trends that we see from the airspace?
Okay, thank you. And while Jenny prepares her take on that one, could you?
I want to respond to a couple of questions that had been asked earlier that we haven't gotten to yet.
You don't have time to answer them all. I think Samuel had raised some of the drivers. The driver that has not explicitly been mentioned, I think, might be in short be said that I read somewhere that we're now currently 1.8 billion middle-income consumers in the world, and in 20 years' time or so, there's going to be 4 billion some middle-income consumers in the world. Maybe that's part of this also, the driver perspective. But Jenny, could you respond to one of your questions, and then if we...
Sure. Yeah, well, I can be very quick. I wanted to pick up on this point about degraded lands. I think that varies very much around the globe. I mean, for example, if you look at the Brazilian Amazon, the Colombian Amazon, et cetera, these are some of the richest forests in the world, and largely through the historical action of indigenous peoples to protect those lands, and that they're now legally recognized as indigenous lands. And on the point about the question about the slide showing the differentiation of deforestation inside and outside indigenous and community lands in Brazil, I think that that's very well documented. There have been a lot of studies that have controlled for different factors like distance from roads and deforestation pressures, and found that even if you match for all of those different factors, that indigenous lands in the Amazon come out with some of the highest, the highest deforestation protection effects relative to other areas around the globe, including strict protected areas. And then to Raymond's point about rollback, I think, unfortunately, the situation is that there's still in many countries around the world, there has not yet been the level of formal recognition of indigenous and community lands to the point where kind of talking about a rollback would be relevant. But in some of the countries that have been most progressive, for example, Brazil, we are now finding, we hear from leading civil society organizations in Brazil that there is increasingly a pushback against recognition of rights.
Thank you. I asked Sten, he was sitting next to me, to take this tough question about drivers. Would you like to say something about these key drivers that affect? I think you touched on it already, but...
Yeah, you mentioned the population growth and also the growth of the global economy and the growing middle class, which is leading to increased consumption, which is good for lifting a lot of people out of poverty and lifting societies. But the backside is, of course, that we are consuming too much of the natural resources. But that's also why I'm saying that the expanding agriculture is a key issue when we are discussing the land resources. And the water issue, we will not have enough water with the climate change and with the demands we will have in agriculture in the future. We have a growing infrastructure. It's corresponding to the area of South Africa within 20 years. So there are many of these big issues dropping down at the very local level. I think there's one word which hasn't been mentioned so far, and that is market. I think the market mechanism is important to take into account when
in what respect?
To generate the controlled investments Sam is speaking about. We have to play with the market. But on the other side, we should be aware that the market mechanism by itself will not solve the problem. You need the governance in addition to that. So they have to work together.
Okay, thank you. You have been tremendously patient. There has not been much air in the room, but there's been a lot of energy which has been benefited the discussion. Again, I would like you to encourage to write down the question for Sven, for instance, was trying to get his question out. Take a post-it note and put it on there, and we'll somehow get back to it. With this, I would like to thank you all, thank all the speakers and the panelists for this first session, and invite you all for lunch. And we should be back here again in 1 hour. That's 15 minutes after 1. So thank you very much.